In the year 1162, somewhere on the windswept grasslands of Mongolia, a child was born who would change the course of human history. He was named Temüjin, and he came into a world of brutal violence, tribal warfare, and constant struggle for survival on the harsh Eurasian steppe. His father was a minor chieftain, his clan was one among many competing tribes, and the Mongol people were fragmented, powerless, and dominated by stronger neighbors. Yet this boy would unite the Mongol tribes, forge the largest contiguous land empire in history, and reshape the civilizations of Eurasia. We know him as Genghis Khan, a name that means universal ruler, and his legacy echoes across 8 centuries to the present day. The Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was a harsh and unforgiving environment. It was a vast ocean of grass stretching from Manchuria to the Caspian Sea, broken by mountains and deserts, subjected to extremes of heat and cold that tested human endurance to its limits. The people who lived there were nomadic pastoralists, moving with their herds of horses, sheep, goats, and cattle in search of grazing lands. They lived in felt tents called jairs, which could be quickly assembled and disassembled as they moved. Their diet consisted primarily of meat and dairy products, with little grain or vegetables. They were superb horsemen, learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Boys were trained from childhood in archery, wrestling, and horsemanship, the skills necessary for both hunting and warfare. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was high, and survival required toughness, adaptability, and ruthlessness. The Mongol tribes were not a unified people but rather a collection of competing clans and confederations. They shared a common language and culture but were divided by fierce rivalries, blood feuds, and the constant struggle for resources and power. Leadership was based on personal ability and charisma rather than hereditary right, though noble lineage mattered. Raids to steal livestock, women, and pastureland were common. Defeated enemies were often killed or enslaved. A successful leader could attract followers and build a confederation, but if he showed weakness, his followers would abandon him or kill him. Warfare between tribes was endemic. The steppe was governed by a harsh code of might makes right, tempered by concepts of loyalty and honor that bound warriors to their chosen leaders. This was the world that shaped Temüjin. Temüjin's early life was marked by tragedy and hardship. His father, Yasugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan who had won some prestige by capturing enemies and forming alliances. When Temüjin was about 9 years old, his father was poisoned by members of the rival Tatar tribe, with whom the Mongols had a long-standing blood feud. Yasugei's death left Temüjin's family vulnerable and destitute. The clan that Yasugei had led abandoned his widows and children, considering them a burden without a strong male protector. Temüjin, his mother Holun, and his siblings were left to fend for themselves on the steppe. They survived by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants, living on the edge of starvation. This experience of abandonment and poverty seared itself into Temüjin's soul and would influence his later policies of promoting loyalty and meritocracy over aristocratic privilege. But he also demonstrated a capacity for violence that shocked even in that violent society. When his half-brother Begtur claimed superior rights to a bird and a fish that Temüjin had caught, Temüjin and his full brother Khazar ambushed and killed Begtur. During these desperate years, Temüjin showed the qualities that would later make him a great leader. He was resourceful, determined, and willing to do whatever was necessary to survive. As Temüjin grew into manhood, he began to rebuild his fortunes through a combination of military prowess, political cunning, and the cultivation of crucial alliances. Temüjin was perhaps 13 years old at the time. His mother was horrified, but the killing established Temüjin as the undisputed head of the family. It also revealed something fundamental about his character. He would not accept subordination or insult. He would eliminate threats ruthlessly. And he would use violence as a tool to achieve his goals without hesitation or remorse. As Temüjin grew into manhood, he began to rebuild his fortunes through a combination of military prowess, political cunning, and the cultivation of crucial alliances. His most important early alliance was with Togrul, the Khan of the Karate tribe, who had been a friend of Temüjin's father. Temüjin presented himself to Togrul as a loyal follower and received protection and support in return. He also formed a bond with Jamuka, a charismatic warrior from another clan who would become both his closest friend and eventually his most dangerous rival. Through these alliances, Temüjin gained the resources and manpower to retrieve his wife Borte, who had been kidnapped by the Merkits, a tribe seeking revenge for an old grievance. The successful rescue raid enhanced Temüjin's reputation as a warrior and leader. Over the next 2 decades, Temüjin methodically built his power base. He attracted followers by rewarding loyalty and ability rather than noble birth, a radical departure from traditional steppe politics. He promoted men based on merit, regardless of their clan or family background. This created a loyal core of supporters who owed their positions entirely to him. He was generous to his followers, sharing plunder equitably and protecting their families. But he was also ruthlessly intolerant of disloyalty. Those who betrayed him were executed without mercy, often along with their entire families. This combination of generosity and terror proved extraordinarily effective in building a devoted following. Temüjin's break with Jamuka was a turning point. The two men had grown apart as their power increased, and their visions for Mongol society diverged. Jamuka represented the traditional aristocratic order, where leadership belonged to those of noble lineage. Temüjin represented something new, a meritocracy where ability mattered more than birth. When conflict between their followers led to open warfare, the Mongol tribes were forced to choose sides. At the Battle of Dalan Baljit in 1187, Jamuka defeated Temüjin, and 70 of Temüjin's followers were boiled alive in cauldrons as punishment. This excessive cruelty backfired, driving many of Jamuka's followers to desert him and join Temüjin, who was seen as more just and less cruel to his own people. It was a lesson Temüjin never forgot. Terror was effective against enemies, but loyalty was won through fair treatment of followers. By 1206, Temüjin had emerged as the dominant power on the Mongolian steppe. He had defeated or incorporated most of the rival tribes, including the Tatars whom he nearly exterminated in revenge for his father's death, the Merkits who had kidnapped his wife, and the Karaits whose Khan Togrul he had once served. Jamuka, his old friend and rival, was eventually betrayed by his own followers and turned over to Temüjin. In a final gesture of respect, Temüjin offered Jamuka reconciliation, but Jamuka refused, asking instead to be executed honorably without spilling his blood. Temüjin granted this request, and Jamuka was killed by having his back broken, a death reserved for nobility. With Jamuka's death, the last major obstacle to Temüjin's supremacy was removed. In 1206, a great assembly called a Kurultai was convened on the banks of the Onan River. Representatives from all the Mongol tribes gathered to formally recognize Temüjin as their supreme leader. He was given the title Genghis Khan, which scholars debate the exact meaning of but is generally understood to mean oceanic ruler or universal ruler. The Kurultai did more than just proclaim a new Khan. It marked the birth of the Mongol nation. For the first time, the fractious tribes of the steppe were united under a single authority. Genghis Khan immediately set about organizing this new nation along military lines. The entire male population was divided into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, creating a decimal system of military organization that was highly efficient. Loyalty was redirected from tribe and clan to these new units and ultimately to Genghis Khan himself. Tribal identities were deliberately broken down and replaced with a new Mongol identity. Genghis Khan also promulgated a law code called the Yasa, which established rules governing everything from military discipline to property rights to religious tolerance. The Yasa was harsh, prescribing death for theft, adultery, and many other offenses. But it applied to everyone equally, noble and common alike, which was revolutionary in a society where aristocrats had previously been above the law. The code emphasized loyalty, discipline, and meritocracy. It also enshrined religious tolerance, allowing people to worship as they chose, a principle that would characterize Mongol rule throughout the empire's existence. Genghis Khan understood that unity and order were essential to transform the Mongols from a collection of squabbling tribes into a force capable of world conquest. The Kurultai of 1206 gave him the authority and legitimacy to impose that unity and order. The Mongol army that Genghis Khan created was not the largest in the world, but it was unquestionably the most effective fighting force of its era. At its peak, the Mongol army numbered perhaps 200,000 warriors, a modest size compared to the armies of China or Persia, which could field hundreds of thousands or even millions of soldiers. What made the Mongols unstoppable was not numerical superiority but rather superior organization, discipline, mobility, tactical flexibility, and an absolute commitment to victory regardless of the cost. The Mongol military system was a revolutionary innovation that combined steppe traditions of mounted archery with sophisticated strategic planning, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare. Understanding how the Mongol war machine functioned is essential to understanding how such a small population could conquer so much of the world so quickly. Every able-bodied Mongol male was a soldier. From childhood, boys were trained in the skills necessary for warfare. They learned to ride horses before they could walk properly, and by age 3 or 4 they were competent riders. Archery training began early, with boys practicing on small bows before graduating to the powerful composite bows that were the Mongols' primary weapon. These bows, made of wood, horn, and sinew glued together, could shoot arrows over 300 yards and could penetrate armor at close range. Mongol warriors could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, twisting in the saddle to fire forward, to the sides, or even backward in the famous Parthian shot. Wrestling and other combat sports developed strength and fighting skills. By the time a Mongol boy reached military age, typically around 15, he was already a highly skilled cavalryman. The decimal organization that Genghis Khan imposed on the Mongol military created a clear command structure and facilitated coordination. Every soldier belonged to a unit of 10 called an arban, commanded by a leader of 10. 10 arbans formed a unit of 100 called a jaghun, commanded by a leader of 100. 10 jaghans formed a unit of 1,000 called a mingan, and 10 minghans formed a unit of 10,000 called a tumun. This system allowed orders to flow rapidly down the chain of command and reports to flow back up. It also created strong bonds of loyalty within units. Men in an arban fought together, lived together, and were collectively responsible for each other's performance. If one man deserted or failed in battle, the entire arban could be punished. This created powerful peer pressure to maintain discipline and courage. Mongol warriors were equipped for speed and endurance rather than heavy protection. They wore armor, typically made of leather or small metal plates sewn onto leather, but their armor was lighter than the full plate armor of European knights or the heavy armor of Chinese cavalry. This made them faster and able to campaign over longer distances. Each warrior had multiple horses, typically 4 or 5, which they rotated during marches. They could campaign year-round, even in winter, when most medieval armies went into winter quarters. They could live off the land, drinking mare's milk and eating meat from their herds, or even drinking their horses' blood in desperate circumstances. This meant they did not need lengthy supply trains that slowed other armies and made them vulnerable to interdiction. Mongol tactics were sophisticated and adaptive. The basic Mongol formation was a series of lines, with light cavalry armed with bows in front and heavier cavalry with lances in the rear. In battle, the light cavalry would advance, firing arrows to disrupt enemy formations. If the enemy charged, the Mongols would retreat in feigned flight, drawing pursuers into ambushes or away from supporting units. This tactic of feigned retreat was perfected by the Mongols and devastated numerous enemies who thought they were pursuing a beaten foe only to be surrounded and destroyed. When enemy formations were disrupted by archery and broken by feigned retreats, the heavy cavalry would charge, smashing into weakened enemy lines. The Mongols also excelled at envelopment, using their superior mobility to attack enemies from multiple directions simultaneously. They coordinated attacks over vast distances using signal arrows, flags, and mounted messengers. Siege warfare was initially a weakness for the Mongols, who came from a nomadic culture with no tradition of attacking fortified cities. But Genghis Khan proved remarkably adaptable. When faced with Chinese fortifications, he recruited Chinese engineers who taught the Mongols to build and use siege engines including catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers. The Mongols became proficient at siege warfare, though they preferred to take cities through treachery, intimidation, or negotiation when possible. They would offer cities a chance to surrender, promising to spare the population if they submitted without resistance. Cities that resisted were shown no mercy. The Mongols would massacre the entire population as a warning to other cities. This policy of exemplary terror was coldly calculated to minimize future resistance. It was often more effective to slaughter one city completely than to fight prolonged sieges at multiple locations. Intelligence and reconnaissance were central to Mongol success. Before invading a region, Mongol agents would spend months or years gathering information about the terrain, the political situation, military strength, and economic resources. Merchants, often Muslim traders who traveled widely, provided valuable intelligence. The Mongols cultivated relationships with local dissidents and rebels who could provide information and support. When the Mongol army arrived, it knew where to find water and pasturage, which routes to take, which cities were wealthy, which leaders were powerful, and what divisions could be exploited. This information advantage gave the Mongols the initiative and allowed them to strike where enemies were weakest. Conversely, the Mongols restricted enemy intelligence gathering by controlling trade routes and executing spies mercilessly. Psychological warfare was another Mongol specialty. The Mongols deliberately cultivated a reputation for invincibility and mercilessness. Stories of Mongol atrocities spread terror before the armies arrived. Cities that had heard how the Mongols massacred populations that resisted often surrendered without a fight. The Mongols encouraged these stories and sometimes exaggerated their numbers by having soldiers lead multiple horses or light extra campfires to make their forces seem larger. They understood that defeating an enemy psychologically was easier than defeating them militarily. But their reputation was not based on propaganda alone. When the Mongols made threats, they carried them out. If they promised to spare a surrendering city, they usually did. If they promised to destroy a city that resisted, they did so utterly and completely. This consistency made their threats credible and their promises trustworthy. Discipline in the Mongol army was absolute and brutal. Cowardice, desertion, disobedience, or drunkenness on campaign were punishable by death. Looting before permission was given was forbidden. Soldiers who broke ranks or failed to follow orders were executed along with their unit commanders. This harsh discipline created an army that functioned with machine-like precision. Orders were followed without question or hesitation. But discipline was balanced with meritocracy and reward. Successful commanders were promoted regardless of their social background. Soldiers who showed courage or initiative were rewarded with plunder, honors, and command positions. Genghis Khan himself had risen from poverty through merit, and he extended the same opportunity to others. This created fanatical loyalty and motivation. A Mongol soldier knew that if he performed well, he could rise to command thousands. If he failed, he would die. The incentives were clear and powerful. The Mongol army also incorporated conquered peoples in innovative ways. Skilled craftsmen, engineers, and artisans from conquered territories were spared and put to work for the Mongol war effort. Chinese engineers built siege engines. Persian administrators managed logistics. Captured soldiers were sometimes formed into auxiliary units to assault fortifications while Mongol cavalry maneuvered behind enemy lines. The Mongols were pragmatic about using any resource that contributed to victory. They also learned from enemies, adopting effective weapons, tactics, and technologies. When they conquered the Jin dynasty in northern China, they learned siege warfare. When they fought in the Middle East, they adapted to desert warfare. The Mongol army was constantly evolving and improving, incorporating lessons from each campaign. Leadership was another crucial factor in Mongol success. Genghis Khan was a military genius, but he was also an organizational genius who created a system that could function without his constant oversight. He appointed capable commanders called noyan to lead his armies, giving them considerable autonomy to achieve their objectives. These commanders were chosen for ability rather than lineage. Many of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, including Jib and Subutai, came from humble backgrounds. Subutai, who would become arguably the greatest military commander in history in terms of battles won and territory conquered, was the son of a blacksmith. Under Genghis Khan's system, such men could rise to command armies of tens of thousands. This meritocratic approach ensured that Mongol armies were led by the most capable commanders, not merely those of noble birth. Religion played an interesting role in Mongol military culture. The Mongols practiced a form of shamanism and ancestor worship, believing that Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had granted Genghis Khan the mandate to rule the world. This belief gave Mongol conquests a religious dimension. They were not merely seeking plunder or territory but fulfilling heaven's will. This sense of divine mission motivated warriors and justified the conquest of the world. At the same time, the Mongols were remarkably tolerant of other religions. They did not force conversions or persecute people for their beliefs. This tolerance was both pragmatic, avoiding unnecessary resistance, and genuine, reflecting the Mongols' view that all religions had value. Genghis Khan famously consulted with religious leaders of various faiths and exempted clergy from taxation. This religious tolerance would become a hallmark of Mongol rule throughout the empire. China in the early 13th century was divided among three major powers, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to Chinese civilization. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China, ruling from Beijing. Founded by the Jurchen people, a semi-nomadic group from Manchuria, the Jin had conquered the northern territories from the Song dynasty a century earlier. Despite their nomadic origins, the Jin had become thoroughly Sinicized, adopting Chinese culture, administration, and military organization. They ruled over a wealthy, populous region that included the heartland of Chinese civilization. To the south, the Song dynasty, pushed out of northern China by the Jin, ruled from their capital at Hangzhou. The Song presided over a sophisticated, prosperous society with advanced technology, thriving commerce, and a brilliant cultural flowering. To the northwest, the Western Xia Kingdom, ruled by the Tangut people, controlled strategic territory along the Silk Road, deriving wealth from trade between east and west. These three powers eyed each other warily, maintaining an uneasy balance of power. Genghis Khan's first target was the Western Xia. In 1209, the Mongol army invaded Western Xia territory, ostensibly because the Xia had refused to provide troops for Mongol campaigns against other tribes. In reality, Genghis Khan wanted to test his army against a settled, fortified state and to secure his southern flank before attacking the more powerful Jin dynasty. The campaign demonstrated both Mongol strengths and weaknesses. The Mongols swept aside Xia field armies with ease, their superior cavalry and tactics overwhelming the sedentary forces. But when they reached the fortified cities, they struggled. The Mongols lacked experience in siege warfare and initially had no equipment for assaulting walls. They laid siege to the capital Yinchuan but could not take it. Eventually, the Xia emperor agreed to become a Mongol vassal and provide tribute. In 1211, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jin dynasty, a far more formidable opponent. The Jin Empire was vast, wealthy, and defended by hundreds of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of fortified cities. Its population numbered tens of millions, dwarfing the Mongol population of perhaps 1 to 2 million. The Jin court viewed the Mongols as barbarian raiders who could be bought off or played against other tribes, as previous nomadic groups had been. They fatally underestimated Genghis Khan and the Mongol army. The Mongols had multiple grievances against the Jin. The Jurchen had traditionally played Mongol tribes against each other and had even crucified a Mongol Khan. Moreover, the Jin territory was wealthy, its cities filled with plunder, its agricultural lands capable of supporting Mongol expansion. Conquest of the Jin would make the Mongols the dominant power in East Asia. The Mongol invasion of Jin territory began in 1211 and would continue for over 2 decades. The initial campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of Mongol military methods. Mongol cavalry swept through the countryside, destroying Jin armies in the field. The Jin relied on infantry and fortifications, a strategy that had worked against previous nomadic invaders but was inadequate against the Mongols. Mongol mounted archers could outmaneuver Jin infantry and destroy them with arrows from beyond spear range. When Jin cavalry did engage, they found themselves outmatched by warriors who had spent their entire lives on horseback. Battle after battle ended in Jin defeat. Mongol armies split into multiple columns, devastating vast areas simultaneously and preventing the Jin from concentrating their forces. The Jin emperor fled from Beijing to Kaifeng in the south, abandoning the northern capital. But taking cities remained a challenge. The Mongols adapted quickly, recruiting Chinese engineers and craftsmen who taught them siege warfare. They learned to build siege towers, battering rams, catapults, and trebuchets. They discovered that undermining walls was effective. They also developed psychological tactics specific to siege warfare. When besieging a city, they would offer the inhabitants a chance to surrender. If the city submitted, the population would be spared, though they might be required to provide food, laborers, and recruits for the Mongol army. If the city resisted, the Mongols would take it eventually through siege engines, starvation, treachery, or assault, and then they would massacre the population. After a few cities were completely destroyed as examples, other cities became more willing to surrender. The Mongols were establishing a pattern that would characterize their conquests. Surrender and survive, resist and die. In 1215, the Mongols besieged Beijing. The siege lasted months, with the defenders resisting stubbornly. The Mongols cut off supplies and bombarded the city with siege engines. Disease broke out within the walls. Food ran out. Finally, in 1215, the Jin commander surrendered. The Mongols entered the city and sacked it thoroughly. Beijing burned for a month. The imperial palace was looted. Countless civilians were killed. The destruction was so thorough that when Marco Polo visited decades later, parts of the city were still in ruins. The fall of Beijing was a tremendous symbolic and strategic victory. The Jin dynasty had lost its ancient capital and much of its prestige. But the Jin were not yet defeated. They continued to resist from Kaifeng in the south, and the war dragged on. The conquest of northern China was not a simple military campaign but a complex undertaking involving diplomacy, administration, and the management of conquered territories. Genghis Khan had to decide what to do with the millions of Chinese people now under Mongol control. Some Mongol commanders advocated exterminating the Chinese population and converting the land to pasture for Mongol herds. This proposal was seriously considered, demonstrating the Mongols' ruthless pragmatism and their initial lack of understanding about how to rule settled agricultural societies. Fortunately for the Chinese, a Khitan advisor named Yelu Chukai convinced Genghis Khan that the Chinese could be more valuable alive than dead. Taxing Chinese agriculture and commerce would provide far more wealth than converting the land to pasture. Genghis Khan accepted this argument, establishing a pattern where Mongol rulers would preserve and exploit the economic systems of conquered territories rather than destroying them. The Southern Song dynasty watched these events with a mixture of relief and concern. The Song had long considered the Jin dynasty their enemy, the Jurchen invaders who had driven them from northern China. Some Song officials hoped the Mongols would destroy the Jin entirely, weakening a traditional foe. The Song even contemplated allying with the Mongols against the Jin, not realizing that the Mongols were a far greater threat than the Jin had ever been. The Song sent embassies to the Mongol court offering cooperation and tribute. Genghis Khan accepted Song tribute but made no commitments. He understood that after the Jin were defeated, the Song would be next. But conquering the Song would have to wait. The Jin War was consuming enormous resources, and threats were emerging in the west that required Genghis Khan's attention. In 1218, tragedy struck the western Xia again. The Xia emperor, who had agreed to become a Mongol vassal, refused to provide troops for Genghis Khan's planned campaign in Central Asia. This refusal was seen as treasonous defiance of a vassal's obligations. Genghis Khan vowed to punish the Xia, but the Central Asian campaign took priority. The Xia's fate would be sealed, but the execution would be delayed. This delay would prove fatal for Genghis Khan himself, demonstrating that even the greatest conqueror was subject to fortune and mortality. But before his death, Genghis Khan would conquer vast territories in Central Asia and the Middle East, adding to the empire in a campaign that showcased Mongol military power at its absolute peak. The campaigns in China had transformed the Mongols from a steppe confederation into an imperial power. They had learned to besiege cities, administer conquered territories, and extract wealth from agricultural and commercial economies. They had recruited Chinese engineers, artisans, and administrators into their service. They had demonstrated that settled civilizations, no matter how wealthy or populous, could not withstand Mongol military might. The psychological impact on Asia was profound. The Jin dynasty, which had dominated northern China for over a century, was collapsing. The aura of Chinese invincibility was shattered. Kingdoms and empires throughout Asia watched with growing alarm as the Mongol threat grew. Some sought to appease the Mongols with tribute and submission. Others prepared to resist. But few understood the magnitude of the storm that was about to break upon them. The Chinese phase of Mongol expansion also revealed the limitations and challenges of maintaining such rapid conquest. The Mongol population was small, and controlling vast territories filled with hostile populations required either massive garrisons or a system of indirect rule that preserved local power structures. The Mongols chose the latter, ruling through local elites who collected taxes and maintained order in exchange for keeping their positions and lives. This system worked but created inefficiencies and opportunities for corruption. The Mongols also faced the challenge of cultural assimilation. The more time they spent in China, the more they risked becoming Sinicized, losing their steppe warrior culture and martial prowess. This tension between maintaining Mongol identity and adapting to sedentary civilization would plague the empire throughout its existence. By 1219, when Genghis Khan turned his attention westward to Central Asia, the Mongols controlled much of northern China, but the Jin dynasty still clung to survival in the south, and the Song dynasty remained untouched. The complete conquest of China would take decades more and would be completed by Genghis Khan's successors. But the foundation had been laid. The Mongols had proven they could conquer and rule sedentary civilizations. They had created administrative systems to extract wealth from agriculture and trade. They had integrated Chinese technology and expertise into their military machine. And they had established the precedent that resistance was futile and submission was the only path to survival. These lessons learned in China would be applied across Eurasia as the Mongol Empire expanded westward, transforming regional conquests into a world empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, encompassing dozens of civilizations and hundreds of millions of people under Mongol rule. While the Mongols were conquering northern China, a powerful empire dominated Central Asia and the Middle East. The Khwarazmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, stretched from modern-day Iran to Afghanistan and into parts of Central Asia. It was a wealthy realm that controlled crucial sections of the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China with the Mediterranean. The Khwarazmian Shah commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers and ruled over prosperous cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Merv. He considered himself one of the most powerful rulers in the world, and he had ambitions to expand his empire further. What he did not realize was that his empire was about to collide with the Mongol war machine, and the collision would result in one of history's most complete and devastating conquests. The destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire would demonstrate Mongol power at its peak and send shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. The conflict began not through Mongol aggression but through a catastrophic misjudgment by Khwarazmian officials. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of several hundred merchants to the Khwarazmian Empire. The caravan was not just a commercial venture but also a diplomatic mission, signaling Mongol interest in peaceful trade relations. The merchants were mostly Muslim Uyghurs and included a Mongol envoy. When the caravan reached the border city of Otrar, the governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of being spies and had them arrested and executed, seizing their valuable goods. Inalchuq was reportedly related to the Shah by marriage and may have acted with the Shah's knowledge or approval. When Genghis Khan heard of the massacre, he sent envoys to Shah Muhammad demanding that Inalchuq be handed over for punishment and that reparations be paid. This was precisely the kind of offense that Genghis Khan could not tolerate. He had offered peaceful trade and had been answered with the murder of his merchants and the humiliation of his envoys. According to Mongol law and custom, such an insult demanded overwhelming retaliation. Moreover, Genghis Khan may have welcomed the excuse for war. The Khwarazmian Empire was wealthy, and its conquest would open the Silk Road to Mongol control. In 1219, Genghis Khan assembled an army estimated at between 150,000 and 200,000 men, a massive force by Mongol standards. He left a portion of his army to continue the war against the Jin in China and led the main force westward across the formidable deserts and mountains that separated Mongolia from Central Asia. The campaign that followed would be a masterpiece of military strategy and one of history's most ruthless conquests. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire was characterized by meticulous planning and brilliant execution. Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple columns that would attack different targets simultaneously, preventing the Khwarazmian forces from concentrating against any single Mongol army. One force, led by Genghis Khan's son Joki, moved north toward the Sir Darya River. Another force under Chagatai and Ögedei besieged Otrar, the city whose governor had sparked the war. The main force under Genghis Khan himself, accompanied by his youngest son Temüjin, struck toward the heart of the empire, targeting the great cities of Bukhara and Samarkand. A fourth force, the most remarkable of all, consisted of only about 20,000 men under the command of generals Jib and Subutai. This force was given extraordinary latitude to operate independently, and it would conduct one of history's most audacious military expeditions, raiding thousands of miles around the Caspian Sea and into Russia. Shah Muhammad's response to the invasion was strategically disastrous. Rather than concentrating his forces to meet the Mongols in the field, he divided his army among his cities, garrisoning each with troops that would be besieged and destroyed piecemeal. This defensive strategy might have worked against a conventional enemy, but it was exactly what the Mongols wanted. By scattering his forces, the Shah ensured that no field army could challenge Mongol mobility and tactical superiority, while individual cities, no matter how strong their walls or large their garrisons, would eventually fall to Mongol siege warfare. The Shah apparently did not understand what kind of enemy he faced. The Mongols were not raiders who would loot and leave but conquerors who would accept nothing less than complete submission. The siege of Otrar lasted 5 months. The city's governor, Inalchuq, defended stubbornly, knowing that the Mongols would show him no mercy. When the outer walls were breached, he retreated to the citadel and continued fighting. The city fell in early 1220, and Inalchuq was captured alive. According to some accounts, the Mongols executed him by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears, symbolically punishing his greed and his deafness to Mongol demands. The population of Otrar was enslaved or killed. The city was systematically demolished. Its fate served as a warning to other cities of what awaited those who resisted. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan's main force moved on Bukhara, one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, a center of learning, culture, and commerce. Bukhara's garrison, seeing the Mongol army approach, attempted to break out and escape but was destroyed by Mongol cavalry. The city leaders then surrendered, hoping to spare the population. Genghis Khan entered Bukhara and, according to tradition, rode his horse into the great mosque and asked if this was the palace of the Shah. When told it was the house of God, he reportedly replied that he was the scourge of God sent to punish the city for its sins. The population was assembled in the main square. Mongol soldiers systematically looted the city, taking anything of value. The young men were conscripted to serve as laborers and assault troops in future sieges. Craftsmen and scholars were identified and taken to Mongolia or sent to serve Mongol administrators elsewhere. The rest of the population was killed or enslaved. The city was burned. Bukhara, one of Central Asia's jewels, was reduced to ruins. The psychological impact was immense. If Bokhara could fall so quickly and completely, what city was safe? From Bokhara, Genghis Khan moved on Samarkand, the capital and largest city of the Khwarazmian Empire. Samarkand was one of the world's greatest cities, a cosmopolitan center of trade and culture with a population estimated at several hundred thousand. It was heavily fortified and garrisoned with perhaps 100,000 soldiers. The Mongols surrounded the city and brought up siege engines. Mongol engineers, many of them conscripted from conquered Chinese and Muslim populations, built trebuchets and catapults to bombard the walls. The Mongols also drove captured civilians ahead of their assaults, forcing defenders to choose between killing their own people or allowing the Mongols to approach the walls. The garrison made a sortie but was destroyed. After 5 days, the city's leaders realized resistance was hopeless and surrendered. Genghis Khan accepted the surrender and then proceeded to plunder the city thoroughly. Shah Muhammad, rather than organizing resistance, fled before the Mongol advance. He escaped from city to city, always staying ahead of Mongol pursuit but never rallying his forces for a decisive battle. His flight shattered what remained of Khwarazmian morale and cohesion. Regional governors and city commanders, seeing that the Shah had abandoned them, made their own decisions about whether to fight or surrender. Most fought, driven by religious fervor, personal honor, or the hope that help might arrive. But without centralized leadership or coordination, they were defeated one by one. Genghis Khan sent Jib and Subutai with a flying column to pursue the Shah. The two generals chased him across Persia with relentless determination. The Shah fled to an island in the Caspian Sea where he died in 1221, broken and defeated. His empire had been destroyed in less than 2 years. The Mongol conquest of the Khwarazmian Empire was unprecedented in its thoroughness and brutality. City after city was besieged, captured, and destroyed. The populations were massacred on a scale that shocked even medieval chroniclers accustomed to warfare's cruelties. The city of Merv, one of the world's largest cities with a population that may have exceeded 1 million, was besieged and captured. The Mongols then spent several days systematically killing the population. Survivors were counted by dividing them among Mongol soldiers, each of whom was required to execute a certain number of people. The death toll at Merv alone may have reached several 100,000. Similar massacres occurred at Nishapur, where the city was razed so completely that the site could be plowed over, and at Herat and countless other cities. The death toll of the Khwarazmian conquest is impossible to determine precisely but likely numbered in the millions. The Mongol destruction was not mindless savagery but calculated terror designed to achieve specific goals. By utterly destroying cities that resisted, the Mongols encouraged other cities to surrender without a fight. The policy worked. After Bokhara and Samarkand fell, many cities surrendered at the first sight of Mongol armies. The Mongols spared surrendering cities the worst atrocities, though they still looted them and imposed heavy tribute. This created incentives for submission. Cities that fought knew they would be annihilated. Cities that surrendered knew they would survive, though impoverished. The choice was stark and effective. The Mongols also understood that they were too few to hold conquered territories by force alone. Terror was a substitute for permanent garrisons. People who had witnessed or heard of Mongol massacres were unlikely to rebel. The environmental and cultural destruction was equally devastating. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for centuries were destroyed. Entire regions were depopulated and returned to desert. The great cities of Central Asia, which had been centers of Islamic learning and Persian culture, were reduced to ruins. Libraries were burned. Scholars were killed. The intellectual and cultural heritage of centuries was destroyed in months. Some historians argue that Central Asia never fully recovered from the Mongol invasions, that the region's decline from a wealthy, sophisticated civilization to a relative backwater dates to this period. While this may overstate the long-term effects, there is no doubt that the Mongol conquest was catastrophic for the region in the short term. Meanwhile, Jib and Subutai continued their remarkable raid. After the Shah's death, they did not return to the main Mongol army but instead continued westward around the Caspian Sea, raiding through the Caucasus into southern Russia. They defeated Georgian and Armenian armies, sacked cities, and explored potential invasion routes. In 1223, they encountered a combined force of Russian princes and Kipchak tribesmen at the Khalkha River. Though outnumbered, the Mongols used their superior tactics and coordination to destroy the allied army. Most of the Russian princes who fought at the Khalkha River were killed, many of them reportedly executed by being crushed under a platform while the Mongols feasted above. Having demonstrated Mongol reach and power, Jib and Subutai returned to Mongolia, completing a circuit of thousands of miles through hostile territory. It was one of military history's most extraordinary expeditions, demonstrating Mongol audacity, endurance, and skill. The conquest of the Khwarazmian Empire established the Mongols as the dominant power in Asia and sent tremors throughout the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad watched with alarm. The Mamluks in Egypt prepared defenses. European kingdoms heard rumors of a mysterious powerful Eastern people. The Mongols had demonstrated that no kingdom, no matter how rich or powerful, was safe from their armies. The invasion also showcased Genghis Khan's strategic genius. He had coordinated multiple armies operating over vast distances, exploited enemy weaknesses, and achieved total victory in an astonishingly short time. But the conquest of Central Asia would be his last great campaign. In 1227, while conducting punitive operations against the Western Xia kingdom that had defied him years earlier, Genghis Khan fell from his horse during a hunt and died, possibly from injuries sustained in the fall, though some sources suggest illness. Genghis Khan's death in 1227 created a potential crisis for the Mongol Empire. Succession disputes had destroyed many previous steppe empires, with rival claimants fighting civil wars that tore apart what their founders had built. Genghis Khan had foreseen this danger and made careful arrangements to prevent it. Before his death, he designated his third son Ögedei as his successor as Great Khan, the supreme ruler of all Mongols. His eldest son Joki had died shortly before Genghis Khan, possibly murdered on his father's orders due to doubts about his loyalty. The second son Chagatai was a fierce warrior but was considered too harsh and inflexible for supreme leadership. The youngest son Talyui was brilliant but was the youngest and thus not favored by Mongol custom. Ögedei was chosen as a compromise, a capable leader who could maintain unity. But Genghis Khan's arrangements went beyond just naming a successor. He divided the empire among his sons and grandsons, creating apanages that gave each branch of the family their own territories and armies while maintaining overall unity under the Great Khan. The system Genghis Khan created was both a strength and a weakness. It prevented immediate civil war by giving each branch of the family substantial power and wealth, reducing incentives for rebellion. But it also created potential for future conflicts as different branches pursued their own interests. Joki's sons, Batu and Orda, received territories in the west, including the steppes north of the Caspian Sea and whatever territories they could conquer in Europe. Chagatai received Central Asia, including the former Khwarazmian lands. Talyui, as the youngest, received the Mongol homeland according to Mongol custom, which dictated that the youngest son inherited the father's original property. Ögedei, as Great Khan, received territories in western Mongolia and northern China and nominal authority over all Mongol lands. Before his death, Genghis Khan had also left instructions for completing the conquest of the Western Xia kingdom, which had defied him by refusing to provide troops. Ögedei fulfilled his father's command with ruthless efficiency. The Western Xia kingdom was invaded and systematically destroyed. The capital was besieged and captured. The royal family was executed. The population was massacred or enslaved. The kingdom ceased to exist. The destruction was so thorough that Western Xia language and culture largely disappeared, absorbed into Chinese civilization. It was a final demonstration of what happened to those who defied the Mongols. With the Western Xia eliminated, Ögedei turned his attention to completing the conquest of northern China. The Jin dynasty, which had been fighting the Mongols for decades, was finally destroyed in 1234. The Jin Emperor committed suicide. The Jin capital Kaifeng fell after a prolonged siege. The entire Jin population of northern China came under Mongol rule, adding millions of subjects and vast wealth to the empire. Ögedei proved to be a capable administrator as well as a military leader. He established a permanent capital at Karakorum in Mongolia, transforming a military camp into a cosmopolitan city. Karakorum became the center of the empire, where representatives from conquered peoples brought tribute and envoys from distant kingdoms sought audience with the great Khan. The city reflected the empire's diversity, with Buddhist temples, Muslim mosques, Christian churches, and Mongol shamanist shrines coexisting. Craftsmen from across Eurasia worked there, creating goods for the Mongol elite. Merchants traded products from China, Persia, India, and Europe. Karakorum was both a symbol of Mongol power and a practical center of administration, though it never rivaled the great cities of the conquered territories in size or sophistication. Ögedei also regularized the empire's administration and tax system. Under Genghis Khan, conquest had been the priority, and administration had been improvised. Ögedei created more systematic governance, establishing a census to count the population for taxation and military conscription purposes. He imposed regular taxes on agricultural and commercial activities. He created a postal system called the Yam, which used relay stations across the empire to carry messages and officials rapidly. The Yam system became one of the Mongol Empire's most important institutions, allowing the Great Khan to communicate with commanders and governors thousands of miles away in days or weeks rather than months. This communication network gave the empire a coordination capability that was revolutionary for its time. Ögedei also began recruiting talented administrators from conquered peoples, particularly Chinese and Muslims, recognizing that nomadic Mongols lacked the skills to manage complex bureaucracies. But Ögedei's most ambitious projects were military. He launched two great campaigns that would expand the empire to its maximum extent. The first was the conquest of southern China, ruled by the Song dynasty. The second was the invasion of Europe. Both campaigns demonstrated Mongol military prowess but also revealed the limits of Mongol power. The Song conquest would drag on for decades and would not be completed during Ögedei's lifetime. The European invasion would achieve spectacular initial success but would ultimately be incomplete. These campaigns showed that even the Mongol war machine had limits, that geography, logistics, and luck could all affect outcomes, and that some enemies were more resilient than others. The invasion of Europe began in 1236. The nominal commander was Ögedei Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and son of Jochi, but the real strategic genius was Subutai, the brilliant general who had served Genghis Khan and who was now in his 60s but still formidable. The invasion force numbered perhaps 120,000 to 150,000 men, relatively small by Mongol standards but enormous for a campaign so far from the Mongol heartland. The army included Mongol core units but also contingents from conquered peoples, particularly Turkic tribes. The campaign's objective was to conquer the Russian principalities and then push into Eastern Europe, potentially subjugating the entire continent. The Mongols would come terrifyingly close to achieving this goal. The Russian principalities in the 13th century were fragmented and weak. Kiev had once been the center of a unified Rus state, but by Ögedei's time, power had fragmented among competing princes who spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. The princes had heard of the Mongols, some had even encountered Mongol raiders after the Battle of Khalkha River in 1223, but they had not united to meet the threat. In 1237, the Mongol invasion began. The Principality of Ryazan was the first to fall. Its prince refused to submit and was destroyed. The city of Ryazan was burned to the ground, its population killed. The Mongol army then swept through Russia like a winter storm, destroying city after city. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, all fell to Mongol siege warfare and experienced the usual massacres and destruction. In 1240, Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, was besieged. Kiev was heavily fortified and defended by a strong garrison. Its princes hoped the city's walls and the defenders' courage would be sufficient. They were wrong. The Mongols brought up siege engines and pounded the walls. They tunneled under the fortifications. They drove conscripted Russian prisoners ahead of assault columns. After a fierce siege, Kiev fell. The Mongols sacked the city with customary thoroughness. The beautiful churches and palaces were looted and burned. The population was massacred. A visitor who passed through a few years later reported that the ground was white with bones and the city was almost deserted. The destruction of Kiev marked the end of the Kievan Rus state and the beginning of Mongol domination of Russia that would last for over 2 centuries, profoundly shaping Russian history and culture. With Russia subjugated, the Mongol army split into several columns and invaded Eastern Europe. One force under Baidar invaded Poland. Another force under Batu and Subutai invaded Hungary. The European kingdoms had heard rumors of the Mongol approach but were unprepared for the reality. The Mongols used their standard tactics of mobility, deception, and terror. In Poland, the Mongol army defeated a combined force of Poles and German knights at the Battle of Legnica in 1241. The Europeans fought bravely but were outmaneuvered and destroyed. The Mongols reportedly collected 9 sacks full of ears cut from the dead to count enemy casualties. Meanwhile, in Hungary, Batu and Subutai faced the army of King Bela IV. At the Battle of Mohi in April 1241, the Mongols achieved one of their most complete victories, destroying a European army of perhaps 100,000 men. The Hungarians were trapped against a river and annihilated. King Bela barely escaped with his life. The Mongol victories in Poland and Hungary sent shockwaves through Europe. The Mongols seemed unstoppable. They had destroyed every army sent against them. They controlled Hungary and were raiding into Austria. European knights, the elite warriors who had dominated medieval warfare, were helpless against Mongol horse archers. European castles, which had been considered impregnable, fell to Mongol siege tactics. Panic spread across Europe. The Pope called for a crusade against the Mongols. Kings and nobles prepared desperate defenses. And then, suddenly, the Mongols withdrew. In December 1241, news reached Batu that Great Khan Ögedei had died. According to Mongol law, all princes had to return to Mongolia to participate in the election of the new Great Khan. Batu withdrew his forces from Hungary and headed east. Europe had been saved not by European armies but by the accidental death of a Mongol ruler thousands of miles away. The question of whether the Mongols could have conquered all of Europe if Ögedei had not died is one of history's great counterfactuals. Some historians argue that Europe was doomed, that Mongol military superiority was overwhelming and that nothing could have stopped them. Others argue that the Mongols were reaching the limits of their logistical capabilities, that European geography with its forests and castles was less favorable to Mongol tactics than the open steppes, and that European resistance would have stiffened. We will never know. What is certain is that Ögedei's death ended Mongol expansion westward. Batu established the Golden Horde, a Mongol Khanate ruling Russia and the western steppes, but he never returned to invade Western Europe. The Mongol Empire had reached its maximum territorial extent in the west. Ögedei's reign had seen the empire expand to unprecedented size. At his death, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the borders of India and the Middle East. It encompassed dozens of different peoples, cultures, and religions. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, surpassing even the empires of Alexander the Great or Rome at their peaks. Ögedei had proven himself a worthy successor to Genghis Khan, completing many of his father's conquests and extending Mongol power even further. But his death created a succession crisis that would reveal tensions within the Mongol leadership and eventually lead to the empire's fragmentation. The question of who would be the next Great Khan, and whether the empire could maintain its unity, would dominate Mongol politics for the next decade and ultimately determine the empire's fate. The death of Ögedei in 1241 plunged the Mongol Empire into political turmoil that would last nearly a decade. The succession should have been straightforward. Ögedei had designated his grandson Shireman as his heir, but the reality was far more complex. Ögedei's widow Temüjin acted as regent and maneuvered to place her son Gayuk on the throne instead. The various branches of the family had different interests and different candidates. Batu, the powerful leader of the Golden Horde in Russia, refused to attend the Kurultai to elect a new Khan, claiming illness but actually protesting the sidelining of his preferred candidates. The empire drifted without strong central leadership for several years while the various factions jockeyed for position. Finally, in 1246, Gayuk was elected Great Khan, but his reign was brief and ineffective. He died in 1248, possibly poisoned, while traveling to confront Batu. The succession crisis deepened. The resolution came through an alliance between Batu and the descendants of Temüjin, Genghis Khan's youngest son. Temüjin himself had died years earlier, possibly poisoned or possibly a victim of excessive drinking, but his widow Sorgatani Beki was one of history's most remarkable women. An Nestorian Christian who was tolerant of all religions, she was politically astute, well-educated, and deeply ambitious for her sons. She had carefully cultivated relationships with all factions of the Mongol leadership and had raised her sons to be capable rulers. Through her negotiations with Batu and other powerful figures, her eldest son Munk was elected Great Khan in 1251. Munk's election marked a shift in power from the descendants of Ögedei to the descendants of Temüjin, a shift that would be permanent. The Ögedei line would never again hold supreme power, and many of its members would be purged by Munk to eliminate potential rivals. Munk proved to be a strong, capable ruler who restored order and purpose to the empire. He was a skilled military commander and a competent administrator who understood the importance of both conquest and governance. He was also more austere and traditional than his predecessors, rejecting luxury and maintaining the harsh steppe warrior culture that had made the Mongols great. Munk launched two major campaigns that would push the empire's boundaries to their furthest extent. He sent his brother Kublai to complete the conquest of southern China, subduing the Song dynasty. And he sent his brother Hulagu to conquer the Middle East, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate and pushing toward Egypt. These campaigns would achieve spectacular successes but would also reveal growing tensions within the Mongol leadership and the practical limits of Mongol expansion. The campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China was a massive undertaking. The Song controlled the wealthiest and most populous region of China, with a sophisticated economy, advanced technology, and strong fortifications. The Song had a powerful navy that controlled the rivers and coast, something the land-based Mongols initially struggled to counter. The Song also benefited from difficult terrain, with rice paddies, rivers, and mountains that hindered Mongol cavalry operations. Previous Mongol attempts to conquer the Song had failed or stalled. But Kublai Khan, who would prove to be one of history's most capable rulers, approached the conquest systematically. He recruited Chinese defectors and administrators who understood Song society and governance. He built a navy to challenge Song control of the waterways. He invested in siege warfare and developed strategies for fighting in the unfamiliar terrain of southern China. The Song conquest would take decades and would not be completed until 1279, long after Munk's death and after Kublai had become Great Khan. But the groundwork was laid during Munk's reign. Kublai established a power base in northern China and began the slow, methodical reduction of Song territory. He also began the transformation from nomadic Mongol chieftain to Chinese emperor, a transformation that would alienate him from traditionalist Mongols but would prove essential for ruling China. Kublai moved his capital from Karakoram to Beijing, which he renamed Khanbalik, the Khan's city. He adopted Chinese court rituals and administrative practices. He surrounded himself with Chinese advisors and scholars. He was becoming less a Mongol Khan and more a Chinese emperor, though he never fully abandoned his Mongol identity. Meanwhile, in the West, Hulagu Khan was leading one of history's most devastating military campaigns. Hulagu was given command of a massive army, reportedly including contingents from every Mongol territory, making it perhaps the most powerful force the Mongols ever assembled. His mission was to subjugate the entire Middle East, eliminating any power that might threaten Mongol hegemony. The first target was the Assassins, a secretive Shia Islamic sect that controlled a network of mountain fortresses in Persia. The Assassins had survived for over a century by carefully choosing their enemies and eliminating opponents through targeted killings. They believed their mountain strongholds were impregnable. They were wrong. Hulagu methodically besieged and captured their fortresses one by one. The assassin leadership was captured and executed. The sect was destroyed as a political and military force. Hulagu then turned toward his ultimate target, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate was the spiritual center of Sunni Islam, though its political power had declined significantly over the centuries. The Caliph in Baghdad still commanded enormous prestige throughout the Islamic world, even if he no longer commanded great armies. When Hulagu demanded the Caliph's submission, the Caliph al-Mustasim, badly advised and apparently unaware of Mongol capabilities, refused. He may have believed that the Muslim world would unite to defend Baghdad, or he may have believed that divine protection would save the holy city. Neither happened. In 1258, Hulagu's army besieged Baghdad. The siege was relatively brief. Mongol siege engines battered the walls while Mongol engineers diverted the Tigris River to flood the city's defenses. When the walls were breached, Mongol forces poured into the city. What followed was one of the great catastrophes of Islamic history. Baghdad, which had been one of the world's greatest cities and the center of Islamic learning for 5 centuries, was systematically destroyed. The libraries, including the House of Wisdom which contained hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts, were burned. Legend says the Tigris ran black with ink from destroyed books and red with blood from slaughtered inhabitants. The death toll is impossible to determine but likely reached into the hundreds of thousands. Caliph al-Mustasim and his family were executed. According to tradition, the caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, a method that avoided spilling royal blood directly. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world in some form since 750 AD, was extinguished. The psychological impact on the Islamic world was profound. If Baghdad could fall and the caliph could be killed, then nothing in the Islamic world was sacred or safe. From Baghdad, Hulagu continued westward, conquering Syria and approaching Egypt. The Mongol advance seemed unstoppable, and it appeared that the entire Middle East would fall under Mongol control. But several factors converged to halt the Mongol expansion. First, Mongol Khan died in 1259 while campaigning in China, possibly from disease or battle wounds. His death created another succession crisis that required Hulagu to consider returning east. Second, Hulagu faced logistical challenges in the hot, arid climate of the Middle East, so different from the steppes or the temperate zones where Mongols had previously operated. Third, and most importantly, Hulagu encountered an enemy capable of defeating the Mongols in battle. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, ruled by a military caste of slave soldiers who were superb cavalry fighters, prepared to resist the Mongol invasion. In 1260, a Mongol force under the general Kitbuka advanced into Palestine and was met by a Mamluk army at Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. The Battle of Ain Jalut was one of history's most significant military engagements. For the first time, a major Mongol army was decisively defeated in open battle. The Mamluks used tactics similar to the Mongols, mobile cavalry with composite bows, and they fought with desperate determination, knowing that defeat meant not just military loss but likely extinction. Kitbuka was killed and his army destroyed. The Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut halted Mongol expansion in the Middle East. Hulagu withdrew to Persia and established the Ilkhanate, a Mongol Khanate that would rule Persia and Iraq, but he never conquered Egypt or the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Mongol Empire had finally reached its limits. The succession crisis following Mong's death revealed deep divisions within the Mongol leadership. Kublai, campaigning in China, and his younger brother Erik Bok, who controlled Karakorum and the Mongol heartland, both claimed the title of Great Khan. Civil war erupted. Kublai had the advantage of controlling the wealthiest territories in China, which provided him with enormous resources. Erik Bok had the advantage of controlling the traditional Mongol homeland and could claim to represent traditional Mongol values against Kublai's Sinicization. The war lasted 4 years and ended with Kublai's victory in 1264. Erik Bok surrendered and was imprisoned. He died 2 years later, possibly poisoned. Kublai was now undisputed Great Khan, but his authority was not universally recognized. The civil war had fractured the empire's unity. The descendants of Chagatai who ruled Central Asia and the descendants of Jochi who ruled the Golden Horde in Russia both nominally acknowledged Kublai as Great Khan, but in practice they operated independently, pursuing their own interests and sometimes fighting each other. The Mongol Empire was fragmenting into separate khanates that would eventually develop distinct identities and policies. Kublai Khan ruled what was increasingly a Chinese dynasty rather than a Mongol empire. Hulagu's Ilkhanate in Persia was becoming a Middle Eastern power. The Golden Horde was becoming a Eurasian steppe empire. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained closest to traditional Mongol culture but was relatively weak and divided. The unity that Genghis Khan had created was dissolving, replaced by a family of related but increasingly independent states. Kublai Khan focused his efforts on China, completing the Song conquest and establishing the Yuan dynasty. In 1271, he formally proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, making himself not just a Mongol Khan but a Chinese emperor in the tradition of previous dynasties. The Song finally fell in 1279 after a desperate last stand. With Song resistance crushed, Kublai ruled all of China, the first non-Chinese ruler to unite the entire country. He attempted to expand further, launching invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, and Vietnam and Java, but these campaigns failed. The Japanese invasions were defeated by a combination of Japanese resistance and typhoons that destroyed Mongol fleets, storms the Japanese called kamikaze or divine wind. The Southeast Asian campaigns also failed, defeated by disease, climate, and determined resistance. Kublai learned that even Mongol power had geographical limits. Island and jungle warfare were very different from steppe and siege warfare. Under Kublai's rule, the Mongol Empire reached its zenith in terms of wealth, culture, and international connections. His court at Khanbaliq was cosmopolitan and magnificent, hosting visitors from across Eurasia. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo allegedly spent years at Kublai's court and returned to Europe with tales of China's wealth and sophistication that Europeans initially dismissed as fantasy. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, facilitated trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia on an unprecedented scale. Merchants could travel from Europe to China in relative safety. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed along the Silk Road. It was a golden age of globalization, though one built on the foundation of earlier conquests and maintained by the threat of Mongol military power. At its height in the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire created something unprecedented in world history, a vast zone of relative peace and security stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. This period, known as the Pax Mongolica or Mongol Peace, facilitated an explosion of trade, cultural exchange, and technological transfer across Eurasia. The same military power that had conquered half the world now guaranteed the safety of trade routes and the free movement of merchants, missionaries, and travelers. The Silk Road, which had existed for over a millennium but had often been disrupted by warfare and banditry, flourished as never before. Ideas, religions, technologies, and diseases moved along these routes, transforming societies across the continent. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality and destruction during the conquest phase, became a force for globalization and cultural interchange during its imperial phase. The foundation of the Pax Mongolica was the Yem system, the postal relay network that Ögedei had established and that his successors expanded. The Yem consisted of stations spaced about 25 miles apart along major routes throughout the empire. Each station maintained fresh horses, food, and accommodations for official travelers who carried special passports called pesas. These passports, often made of precious metals and inscribed with the Khan's authority, entitled the bearer to use the Yem system and to demand food, horses, and assistance from local populations. The system allowed messages to travel at astonishing speeds. A courier could cover over 200 miles in a single day by riding one horse to exhaustion, switching to a fresh mount at a yam station, and continuing immediately. This meant that a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than months, giving the Mongol rulers a communication advantage that their enemies could not match. But the yam system served more than just official purposes. Merchants who obtained pases could also use the system, accelerating trade and reducing costs. The Mongols actively encouraged commerce because they derived enormous revenue from taxing trade. Unlike many medieval rulers who saw merchants as suspect or tried to restrict their activities, the Mongols protected merchants and facilitated their business. Caravans traveled under Mongol protection, and attacks on merchants were punished severely. The Mongols established standard weights and measures across the empire and enforced contracts through a legal system that, while harsh, was relatively predictable and impartial. They even experimented with paper currency in China, an innovation that fascinated European visitors like Marco Polo who came from societies where only metal coins were used. The religious tolerance that Genghis Khan had established became a defining characteristic of Mongol rule. The Mongols themselves practiced shamanism and worshipped Tingri, the eternal blue sky, but they were pragmatic about religion. They believed that all religions had value and that antagonizing religious communities was counterproductive. Consequently, the Mongol Empire became a haven for religious minorities and a meeting ground for different faiths. Nestorian Christians, who had been persecuted in the Byzantine Empire and were a minority in the Islamic world, flourished under Mongol protection. Several prominent Mongol queens and nobles were Nestorian Christians, including Sorgatani Beki, mother of Mungkin Kubilai. Buddhist monasteries received Mongol patronage and exemption from taxes. Islamic scholars and Sufi mystics traveled freely through Mongol lands. Even Taoists and Confucians in China received tolerance and support. This religious tolerance facilitated remarkable interfaith dialogue and cultural exchange. In Karakoram and later in Khanbaliq, religious leaders from different traditions debated theology in the Khan's presence. Christian missionaries from Europe, most famously the Franciscan friars John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, traveled to the Mongol court hoping to convert the Khans to Christianity. They failed to convert the Mongols but brought back detailed descriptions of the empire that gave Europeans their first accurate information about this distant power. Muslim scholars served as administrators and advisors in the Mongol court, bringing Islamic learning and Persian administrative practices. Chinese Confucian scholars, though sometimes discriminated against under Mongol rule, still influenced governance and education. This cosmopolitan atmosphere made the Mongol court one of the world's most diverse and intellectually vibrant places. The movement of people across the empire brought technological and cultural exchanges that transformed societies. Chinese technologies spread westward. Gunpowder, which had been invented in China centuries earlier but had been used primarily for fireworks and signal flares, began to be developed as a weapon. The Mongols used early gunpowder weapons in their sieges and introduced the technology to the Middle East and Europe. Printing technology, another Chinese invention, spread along trade routes. Papermaking techniques improved and spread. Agricultural techniques and crops moved across the empire. Persian and Arab medical knowledge reached China. Chinese medical practices, including acupuncture and herbal remedies, were studied by Persian physicians. The exchange of ideas and innovations accelerated dramatically compared to previous centuries when the distance and dangers of travel had limited such exchanges. Art and craftsmanship also flourished under Mongol patronage, though in distinctive ways that reflected Mongol preferences. The Mongols themselves were not great builders or artists in the traditional sense, but they appreciated craftsmanship and collected beautiful objects from across their empire. They commissioned works from the finest craftsmen they could find, bringing together Persian miniature painters, Chinese ceramicists, European goldsmiths, and Russian icon painters. This mixing of artistic traditions created new synthetic styles. Persian miniature painting began incorporating Chinese landscape elements and painting techniques. Chinese porcelain influenced Persian and Middle Eastern ceramics. Mongol patrons commissioned illuminated manuscripts that combined Islamic, Christian, and Buddhist motifs. The cross-pollination of artistic traditions during the Mongol period contributed to cultural renaissances in several regions. Marco Polo's account of his travels, whether entirely accurate or partially embellished, captures the wonder that the Mongol Empire inspired in European observers. According to his account, he spent 17 years in Ögedei Khan's service, traveling throughout China and Southeast Asia. His descriptions of Chinese cities, particularly Hangzhou, which he called Qinsai and described as the finest and noblest city in the world, amazed Europeans who could not imagine cities of such size and sophistication. He described paper currency, coal burning for heat, asbestos fabric, and the efficient postal system. He described the Khan's lavish court, vast hunting parks, and elaborate festivals. Whether Marco Polo actually traveled to China, as some modern scholars question, or whether he compiled his account from other travelers' reports, his book introduced medieval Europe to the reality of advanced civilizations in the East and stimulated European interest in Asian trade. The Mongol Empire also facilitated the spread of diseases across Eurasia, most catastrophically the Black Death. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague, existed in rodent populations in Central Asia. As trade increased and people moved more freely across the empire, the plague spread along trade routes. In the 1340s, it reached China, the Middle East, and Europe, causing one of history's worst pandemics. The Black Death killed perhaps a third to half of Europe's population and similarly devastating percentages in the Middle East and China. Some historians have suggested that Mongol military campaigns directly spread the plague, citing the siege of Kaffa in Crimea where the Mongols allegedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls. Whether this specific incident occurred or not, the broader point stands. The same trade networks and population movements that spread technology and culture also spread disease. The Pax Mongolica had a dark side, and the plague was arguably its deadliest consequence. The extent and nature of Mongol cultural influence varied across the different khanates. In China, Ögedei Khan and his Yuan dynasty successors adopted Chinese governing practices and tried to become legitimate Chinese emperors, though they maintained some Mongol distinctiveness and favored Mongols and Central Asians in high positions. In Persia, Hulagu's Ilkhanate gradually converted to Islam, with Ghazan Khan's conversion in 1295 marking a turning point. The Ilkhans became patrons of Persian culture and Islamic learning, though they retained Mongol military organization. In Russia, the Golden Horde maintained its nomadic steppe culture and converted to Islam in the 14th century under Özbeg Khan, ruling the Russian principalities as overlords who collected tribute but allowed local rulers considerable autonomy. Despite the cosmopolitanism and cultural flourishing, the Mongol Empire rested on a foundation of violence and the threat of violence. The peace was maintained because everyone knew what had happened during the conquests and what would happen if they rebelled. Revolts were crushed with extreme brutality. Entire cities that rebelled were destroyed as examples. The Mongol legal code, the Yasa, prescribed death for many offenses, and Mongol justice was swift and harsh. The empire also maintained large standing armies and continued to wage wars on its frontiers. The Mongols never entirely gave up their warrior culture or their readiness to use force. The Pax Mongolica was less a genuine peace than an armed hegemony, a system where one power was so dominant that resistance seemed futile and submission seemed prudent. The Mongol Empire at its height was a paradox. It was incredibly brutal during conquest but relatively tolerant during governance. It destroyed countless cities and killed millions but then facilitated trade and cultural exchange that enriched survivors. It was ruled by illiterate nomads but patronized literature, science, and art. It united vast territories under a single authority but was fragmenting into increasingly independent khanates. It created conditions for globalization but also spread devastating plagues. It was simultaneously one of history's greatest destructions and one of its greatest creations. Understanding this paradox requires seeing the Mongol Empire not as uniformly good or evil but as a complex historical phenomenon that had different effects on different peoples at different times. The golden age of the Pax Mongolica was relatively brief, lasting perhaps from the 1260s to the early 1400s, less than a century and a half. But its impact was profound and long-lasting. It demonstrated that Eurasia could function as a connected zone rather than as isolated civilizations. It showed that international trade could operate on a vast scale if political conditions permitted. It facilitated exchanges of knowledge and technology that accelerated development in multiple societies. And it created memories and precedents of empire that would influence later empire builders. The Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and even the British Empire in Asia all drew on Mongol precedents and inherited territories that had been shaped by Mongol rule. The Mongol Empire's legacy extended far beyond its own existence, influencing Eurasian history for centuries after the empire itself had fragmented and declined. The Mongol Empire's unity began fracturing even before it reached its maximum territorial extent. The civil war between Kublai and Erik Bok in the 1260s revealed that different factions of the Mongol leadership had fundamentally different visions for the empire's future. Kublai represented adaptation to Chinese civilization, ruling from a Chinese capital with Chinese administrative practices. Erik Bok represented traditionalism, maintaining the nomadic steppe culture and ruling from Karakoram. Kublai's victory meant that the empire would be ruled by a Khan who was increasingly Chinese, but it also meant that Mongols who valued traditional ways felt alienated from the central authority. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia increasingly went their own ways, paying lip service to Kublai's supremacy but acting independently. The fragmentation was driven by geography, culture, and conflicting interests. The distances involved were simply too vast for effective centralized control with medieval technology. A message from Beijing to Russia took weeks even with the YIM system. Military forces could not be rapidly deployed across the empire. Local problems required local solutions, and local commanders made decisions without consulting the Great Khan. Moreover, the different Khanates were adapting to their local environments and populations. The Golden Horde was becoming a Turkic Islamic state ruling over Orthodox Christian Russians. The Ilkhanate was becoming a Persian Islamic state. The Yuan dynasty was becoming a Chinese dynasty. These different adaptations created diverging interests and identities. What benefited China might harm Persia. What the Golden Horde wanted might conflict with Yuan priorities. Conflicts between the Khanates became common. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde fought a series of wars over control of the Caucasus region. These wars were ostensibly about territorial control and trade routes, but they also reflected deeper religious and cultural differences. The Ilkhanate initially remained shamanist and later Buddhist before converting to Islam, while the Golden Horde converted to Islam earlier and pursued alliances with the Muslim Mamluks of Egypt against the Ilkhanate. The paradox of Mongol princes fighting each other rather than conquering new territories demonstrated how thoroughly the empire had fragmented. Genghis Khan's vision of a unified Mongol nation ruling the world had given way to competing Mongol states pursuing their own agendas. The Yuan dynasty in China faced unique challenges. Kublai Khan had succeeded in conquering all of China and establishing Mongol rule, but governing China proved far more difficult than conquering it. The Mongols were a tiny minority ruling over a massive Chinese population that outnumbered them hundreds to one. The Mongols maintained their dominance through military superiority and through a deliberate policy of ethnic discrimination that favored Mongols and Central Asians over Chinese. Chinese were excluded from the highest government positions and from military commands. The Mongols feared, not without reason, that allowing Chinese into positions of power would eventually lead to the Mongols being absorbed by Chinese culture and losing their identity. But this discrimination created resentment and made it difficult to win Chinese loyalty. Kublai Khan's successors were less capable than he had been, and the quality of Yuan governance declined. Court politics became increasingly dominated by intrigue, corruption, and power struggles between Mongol factions. The Mongol elite in China became cynicized despite efforts to maintain cultural distinctiveness, adopting Chinese luxuries and customs while losing the martial prowess and discipline that had made their ancestors formidable. Meanwhile, the Chinese population suffered from heavy taxation, forced labor on massive construction projects, and the devastating effects of the Black Death which hit China hard in the 1330s and 40s. Natural disasters including floods and famines, exacerbated by government corruption and incompetence, created widespread suffering. Banditry and rebellion became endemic. The most serious rebellion against Yuan rule was the Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the 1350s. The Red Turbans were a complex movement combining Chinese nationalism, Buddhist millenarianism, and peasant grievances. They believed that the Yuan dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and that a new era was beginning. The rebellion spread rapidly across southern China, tapping into deep wells of resentment against Mongol rule. The Yuan government's response was hampered by internal divisions, military incompetence, and financial exhaustion. Different Mongol factions competed for control of the response to the rebellion rather than cooperating to suppress it. Chinese generals who might have defeated the rebels were not trusted with sufficient authority. The Yuan dynasty's grip on China was weakening. From the chaos of the Red Turban Rebellion emerged a new Chinese dynasty. Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant who had joined the rebels and risen through the ranks through military ability and ruthless political cunning, defeated his rivals and established himself as the dominant rebel leader. In 1368, he declared himself emperor of the Ming dynasty and launched a final campaign against the Yuan. The Mongol court in Beijing, recognizing that the situation was hopeless, fled north to Mongolia. The Yuan dynasty's rule over China had ended after less than a century. Zhu Yuanzhang, who took the reign name Hongwu, pursued the retreating Mongols north and destroyed much of their military power. The Mongols were driven back to their homeland steppes, their Chinese empire lost forever. The Great Yuan dynasty, which had once ruled the richest empire on earth, was reduced to a remnant state struggling to survive in the harsh Mongolian heartland. The fall of the Yuan dynasty was a catastrophic blow to Mongol prestige and power, but it was not the only Khanate facing collapse. The Ilkhanate in Persia had been weakening since the early 1400s. After converting to Islam and becoming patrons of Persian culture, the Khans had seemed to establish a stable regime. But succession disputes, financial problems caused by overtaxation and economic disruption, and the devastating impact of the Black Death undermined the Khanate's stability. In 1335, the last effective Khan died, and the Khanate fragmented into competing regional powers. Former Ilkhanate territories were fought over by various dynasties and warlords, none of whom could re-establish centralized control. The Mongol ruling class in Persia was absorbed into the local population, intermarrying with Persians and Turks and losing their distinct identity. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia had always been the weakest and most divided of the major Khanates. It split into eastern and western portions that pursued different policies and often fought each other. The western Chagatai Khanate became increasingly Islamic and sedentary, while the eastern portion remained nomadic and shamanist longer. Both portions were unstable, with frequent succession disputes and rebellions. The Chagatai Khanate's main historical significance became serving as a base for Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan through marriage and who would attempt to recreate the Mongol Empire in the late 1400s. But Timur's empire, while devastating and extensive, proved as ephemeral as the Mongol Empire itself, collapsing after his death and leaving behind destruction rather than lasting institutions. Only the Golden Horde maintained something resembling stability and power into the 1500s. The Golden Horde ruled the Russian principalities through a system of indirect control, allowing Russian princes to govern locally while collecting tribute and maintaining ultimate authority. This system worked for over 2 centuries, shaping Russian political development in profound ways. The Mongol period, called the Tatar yoke in Russian historiography, influenced Russian autocratic traditions, military organization, and administrative practices. But the Golden Horde also gradually weakened. Conversion to Islam alienated the Christian Russian population. Internal succession disputes divided the Khanate. And the rise of Moscow as a powerful principality created a Russian center of resistance. In 1380, Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow defeated a Golden Horde army at the Battle of Kulikovo. This victory demonstrated that the Mongols were not invincible and inspired Russian resistance. Though the Golden Horde retaliated and reasserted control, the psychological impact of Kulikovo was permanent. Russian princes became increasingly assertive. In 1480, Ivan III of Moscow refused to pay tribute to the Golden Horde. When a Mongol army advanced to enforce submission, Russian forces faced them at the Ugra River. Neither side was willing to risk battle, and after a standoff, the Mongols withdrew. This bloodless confrontation, known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River, effectively ended Mongol overlordship of Russia. The Golden Horde fragmented into smaller khanates including the khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimea, each independent and often hostile to each other. The unified Mongol power that had terrorized Russia was gone. By 1500, the Mongol Empire as a unified entity had ceased to exist. The khanates had fragmented or been conquered. The Mongols had been driven from China, Persia, and Russia. What remained were remnant khanates in Central Asia and successor states that claimed Mongol heritage but lacked the power and unity of the original empire. The rapid collapse was in some ways as remarkable as the rapid rise. In less than 3 centuries, the Mongols had gone from obscure steppe tribes to rulers of the largest land empire in history and back to regional players. The factors behind this collapse were multiple. The difficulty of maintaining unity over vast distances, the cultural assimilation of conquerors by conquered populations, succession disputes exacerbated by Mongol inheritance customs, economic exhaustion from continuous warfare, the devastating impact of plagues, and the eventual recovery and resistance of conquered peoples. The Mongol collapse left a power vacuum across Eurasia that various powers rushed to fill. In China, the Ming dynasty re-established Chinese rule and deliberately rejected many Yuan dynasty practices, though they retained some administrative innovations. In Persia, various Turkic and Persian dynasties competed for power, eventually leading to the rise of the Safavid dynasty. In Russia, Moscow emerged as the dominant power and began expanding, eventually creating a new Russian empire that would rule over many former Mongol territories. In Central Asia, various Uzbek and Kazakh khanates emerged from the wreckage of Mongol power. The post-Mongol world was more fragmented than the Mongol Empire had been, but it was also more dynamic, with new powers rising and competing rather than submitting to a single overwhelming force. The question of why the Mongol Empire collapsed so completely while other empires like Rome or China survived in some form for much longer has fascinated historians. Part of the answer lies in the nature of Mongol rule. The empire was held together primarily by military force and the personal authority of strong khans. When military superiority was lost or when weak khans failed to maintain authority, the empire lacked alternative sources of legitimacy or mechanisms of control. The Mongols had not created strong bureaucratic institutions or ideological foundations that could survive military defeat. They had relied on conquest and terror, and when conquest ended and terror lost its effectiveness, there was little left to hold the empire together. The Mongol Empire was a magnificent achievement of military organization and strategic vision, but it was also inherently unstable and temporary, a meteor that blazed across history before burning out. The Mongol Empire may have collapsed, but its legacy shaped Eurasia for centuries and continues to influence the modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. No other empire in history conquered so much territory so quickly or connected so many disparate civilizations. The Mongols demonstrated that the world could function as an interconnected system rather than as isolated regions. They showed that military innovation and organization could overcome numerical disadvantage. They proved that ruthless pragmatism combined with strategic vision could build empires, though maintaining them required different skills than conquering them. Understanding the Mongol legacy requires examining their impact on military affairs, politics, economics, culture, and the historical imagination across the regions they conquered and beyond. The most immediate and visible Mongol legacy was military. The Mongol way of war, emphasizing mobility, discipline, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare, influenced military thinking across Eurasia. European armies began adopting some Mongol tactical innovations, though the full transition to cavalry warfare in the Mongol style never occurred in Europe due to different geography and social structures. The Ottomans, who would build one of history's great empires in the centuries after Mongol power declined, learned extensively from Mongol military methods. The Russian military absorbed Mongol organizational principles and cavalry tactics. Even the Mughals in India, who were descended from both Mongol and Turkic conquerors, employed military methods that reflected Mongol influence. The effectiveness of mounted archery, the importance of mobility and speed, and the integration of siege warfare with cavalry operations, all lessons the Mongols had demonstrated, became standard elements of military doctrine. The political legacy was equally profound though more varied across different regions. In China, the Yuan dynasty's brief rule left complex impacts. The Mongols had unified China after centuries of division, and subsequent Chinese dynasties would maintain this unity. The Ming and Qing dynasties that followed the Yuan inherited administrative structures and precedents from Mongol rule, even while they rejected Mongol cultural influence. The concept of a multi-ethnic empire ruling over diverse populations through pragmatic adaptation rather than forced cultural assimilation, a Mongol innovation, influenced later Chinese imperial practice. The Qing dynasty, established by the Manchus in 1644, consciously modeled some of their policies on Yuan precedents, ruling as both Manchu emperors and Chinese sons of heaven. In Russia, the Mongol legacy was enormous and controversial. The period of Mongol domination, from the 13th to 15th centuries, coincided with the decline of Kievan Rus and the rise of Moscow. Russian historians have debated for centuries whether the Mongol period was primarily destructive, setting Russia back and cutting it off from European developments, or whether it contributed to the creation of the Russian state and its distinctive political culture. There is evidence for both views. The Mongols certainly destroyed cities, killed populations, and disrupted cultural and economic development. The destruction of Kiev ended the Kievan Rus civilization. But Mongol rule also created conditions that allowed Moscow to rise. The Mongol system of ruling through local princes gave Moscow's rulers opportunities to expand their power while nominally serving as Mongol tribute collectors. Russian autocracy, the concentration of absolute power in the ruler, has often been attributed partly to Mongol influence. The Mongol Khans wielded unchallenged authority, and Russian princes who dealt with them absorbed this model. The administrative efficiency of the Mongol postal system and census-taking influenced Russian state-building. Even some Russian words and administrative terms derive from Mongol or Turkic languages, evidence of cultural exchange during the occupation. The Russian Empire that emerged in the 16 and 1700s would expand across the same steppes the Mongols had ruled, often incorporating former Mongol territories and populations. Some historians see the Russian Empire as in some ways a successor state to the Golden Horde, a Eurasian empire ruling over diverse peoples from a Slavic core. In the Middle East, the Mongol invasions had catastrophic short-term effects but complex long-term consequences. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate ended the last symbol of unified Islamic authority and contributed to political fragmentation that persists to this day. The Mongol destruction of irrigation systems in Iraq turned once fertile regions into desert. The death toll from the conquest set back population and economic development for generations. But the Mongol period also facilitated the rise of new powers. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, which had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut, emerged as the leading Sunni Islamic power. The Ottoman Empire, which would dominate the Middle East and Eastern Europe for centuries, arose partly from Turkic groups displaced by Mongol conquests. The Safavid dynasty in Persia, which established Shia Islam as the state religion and created the basis for modern Iran, emerged from the post-Mongol power struggles. The economic legacy of the Mongol Empire centered on the development of trade networks and commercial practices. The Pax Mongolica had demonstrated that long-distance trade could flourish when political conditions were favorable. The routes and contacts established during the Mongol period continued to influence trade patterns for centuries. European interest in direct access to Asian markets, which would drive the age of exploration, was stimulated partly by knowledge of Asian wealth gained during the Mongol period. Marco Polo's account of his travels, whether entirely accurate or not, inspired European merchants and adventurers. The search for alternative routes to Asia after the Mongol Empire collapsed and the overland routes became more dangerous again contributed to European exploration of sea routes around Africa and eventually to the Americas. The spread of technologies during the Mongol period had lasting impacts. Gunpowder technology, which originated in China, spread westward during the Mongol period and would revolutionize warfare. By the 1500s, gunpowder weapons were dominant on battlefields from Japan to Europe. The Mongols themselves never fully exploited gunpowder's military potential, perhaps because traditional cavalry warfare had served them so well, but they facilitated its spread. Printing technology also diffused during the Mongol period. Paper and papermaking techniques spread westward. Agricultural techniques and crops moved across the empire. The Mongols themselves introduced little new technology, but they created conditions for existing technologies to spread faster and further than they otherwise would have. This technological exchange accelerated development across Eurasia. The cultural and intellectual legacy is harder to quantify but equally important. The Mongol period demonstrated that different civilizations could coexist and learn from each other. The religious tolerance practiced by most Mongol rulers, though motivated by pragmatism rather than principle, created spaces where different faiths interacted. Nestorian Christianity survived in Asia partly due to Mongol protection. Islamic scholarship in Persian flourished under Mongol patronage after the initial destruction. Buddhist monks traveled across the empire establishing monasteries and translating texts. This cross-cultural interchange created synthetic forms of art, literature, and learning that drew on multiple traditions. Persian miniature painting incorporating Chinese techniques, Chinese ceramics influenced by Persian designs, and illuminated manuscripts blending Islamic, Christian, and Buddhist motifs all testify to this cultural mixing. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire is visible today. Genetic studies have shown that a significant percentage of men in regions once conquered by the Mongols share a Y chromosome lineage that appears to originate with Genghis Khan or his close male relatives. The estimate is that roughly 16 million men alive today are direct male-line descendants of Genghis Khan. This genetic signature reflects both the Mongol elite's practice of taking multiple wives and concubines and the sheer scale of Mongol conquests. The Mongol ruling class in many regions intermarried with local elites, creating mixed populations. In Central Asia particularly, the boundaries between Mongol and Turkic populations became blurred through intermarriage. Many modern ethnic groups in Central Asia and Russia have Mongol ancestry mixed with other ethnic origins. The environmental legacy of the Mongol conquests is contested among scholars. Some researchers have suggested that the Mongol invasions had a measurable impact on global climate. The theory is that the massive death toll, perhaps 40 million people or more across Eurasia, led to the reversion of farmland to forest and grassland. This regrowth of vegetation absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, contributing to global cooling that may have influenced the Little Ice Age. While this theory remains controversial and is difficult to prove definitively, it highlights the unprecedented scale of Mongol impact. The Mongols killed so many people that it may have affected the planet's climate. Whether this theory is correct or not, it illustrates how historians are still discovering new dimensions of Mongol influence. The psychological and symbolic legacy of the Mongol Empire varies dramatically across cultures. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is revered as the founding father of the nation, a hero who united disparate tribes and created an empire. Modern Mongolia celebrates Genghis Khan with monuments, currency featuring his image, and national holidays. The capital city's airport is named after him. Mongolians see the empire as a source of national pride, evidence that their ancestors were world conquerors. In contrast, many of the peoples conquered by the Mongols remember them primarily as destroyers. For centuries after the conquests, Mongol became synonymous with barbarian in many languages. Chinese, Persian, and Arab historians portrayed the Mongols as savage and uncivilized, a force of destruction unleashed upon the world. Only in recent decades have historians begun to offer more nuanced assessments that acknowledge both the destruction the Mongols caused and the systems they created. The question of how to evaluate the Mongol Empire morally and historically remains contentious. From one perspective, the Mongols were responsible for killing millions of people, destroying countless cities, and setting back civilization in many regions. The death toll of their conquests rivals the worst atrocities of the 20th century in absolute terms and exceeds them as a percentage of world population. From another perspective, the Mongols created the most extensive land empire in history, facilitated unprecedented cultural exchange and technological diffusion, demonstrated religious tolerance rare in medieval times, and showed that effective governance could transcend ethnic and cultural boundaries. Both assessments are true. The Mongol Empire was simultaneously one of history's greatest catastrophes and one of its most remarkable achievements. Modern scholarship on the Mongol Empire has moved away from the simplistic narratives of earlier centuries toward more complex understandings. Rather than seeing the Mongols as either noble savages or barbaric destroyers, historians now recognize them as sophisticated political and military leaders who adapted to the varied challenges of ruling diverse territories. The revival of interest in the Silk Road and in the history of globalization has brought new attention to the Mongol role in connecting Eurasia. The rise of world history as a field has positioned the Mongol Empire as a crucial case study in how large-scale empires function and how different civilizations interact. The Mongols have moved from the margins of historical consciousness to the center of debates about empire, globalization, and cultural exchange. The Mongol Empire's collapse did not end Mongol attempts to recreate past glory. In the 1400s, Timur claimed Genghis Khan's legacy and built a vast empire centered on Samarkand, though it proved ephemeral. In the 1600s, the Mughals ruled India as descendants of both Genghis Khan and Timur, creating one of history's great empires and leaving an enduring cultural legacy including the Taj Mahal. Even the Manchu Qing dynasty that ruled China from 1644 to 1912 can be seen as influenced by Mongol imperial precedents, ruling as multi-ethnic empire builders rather than simply as Chinese emperors. The memory and myth of Mongol power continued to inspire conquerors and empire builders for centuries after the original empire had fragmented. Genghis Khan's shadow fell across history long after his death, influencing how subsequent rulers thought about empire, conquest, and power. 8 centuries after Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, the empire he created continues to fascinate, inspire, and provoke debate. The Mongol Empire represents one of history's most dramatic examples of what determined leadership, military innovation, and ruthless pragmatism can achieve. It also demonstrates the limits of conquest, the challenges of maintaining vast empires, and the ultimate futility of building power structures based primarily on military force. The lessons of the Mongol experience remain relevant to understanding modern questions about globalization, cultural exchange, military strategy, governance, and the rise and fall of great powers. The most obvious lesson from the Mongol experience is that superior military organization and tactics can overcome numerical disadvantage and technological parity. The Mongols did not have better weapons than their enemies. Chinese, Persian, and European soldiers had access to similar or even superior metallurgy, similar armor, and similar weapons technology. What the Mongols had was better organization, better discipline, better intelligence, better logistics, and better leadership. They trained harder, coordinated more effectively, adapted more quickly, and fought with greater determination than their enemies. The Mongol military was a professional force where promotion was based on merit rather than birth, where soldiers were part of efficient units with clear command structures, and where innovation was encouraged rather than resisted. Modern militaries have learned these lessons, but the Mongols demonstrated them at a time when most armies were poorly organized feudal levies. The Mongol Empire also demonstrates the power of psychological warfare and reputation management. The Mongols cultivated a deliberate image of invincibility and mercilessness. They made good on their threats, ensuring that promises of destruction were credible. But they also made good on their promises of mercy to those who surrendered, ensuring that submission was a viable option. This combination of terror and pragmatism was coldly effective. Many cities surrendered without a fight because they had heard what happened to cities that resisted. The Mongols won battles before fighting them by destroying enemy morale and will to resist. Modern military doctrine recognizes the importance of psychological operations, information warfare, and perception management, all things the Mongols intuitively understood and ruthlessly exploited centuries before these became formal military disciplines. The Mongol approach to governance offers both positive and negative lessons. On the positive side, the Mongols demonstrated remarkable tolerance for diversity. They ruled over peoples of different religions, cultures, and languages without attempting to impose cultural uniformity. They employed talented individuals regardless of ethnic background. They facilitated trade and communication across vast distances. They created a form of globalization that benefited many people, at least those who survived the initial conquests. These are admirable qualities that modern multicultural societies aspire to achieve. On the negative side, Mongol rule ultimately rested on violence and the threat of violence rather than on legitimacy, consent, or shared values. When military superiority was lost, the empire collapsed rapidly because it lacked deeper foundations. The lesson is that diversity and tolerance are admirable, but sustainable governance requires more than just military power and pragmatic administration. The Mongol Empire's fragmentation illustrates the challenges of maintaining large, diverse empires over long periods. Distance, cultural differences, and conflicting interests all pulled the empire apart. The Mongol experience suggests that pre-modern empires had natural size limits determined by communication technology and transportation capabilities. An empire could only be as large as its ruler could effectively communicate with and control. The Mongol Yem system was remarkably efficient for its time, but it still took weeks for messages to cross the empire. This meant that distant regions operated semi-independently, making fragmentation almost inevitable over time. Modern technology has changed these calculations, allowing communication and control over global distances in real time, but the underlying principle remains relevant. Empires and nations require not just initial conquest but ongoing maintenance of unity through shared identity, institutions, and interests. The environmental and demographic impacts of the Mongol conquests offer sobering lessons about the costs of war and conquest. The death toll of the Mongol conquests, estimated at tens of millions, was catastrophic. Entire regions were depopulated. Sophisticated civilizations were destroyed. Centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture were lost. The environmental damage from destroyed irrigation systems and depopulated agricultural lands had long-lasting effects. While the Mongols later facilitated trade and cultural exchange, this came only after immense destruction during the conquest phase. The lesson is that the human and environmental costs of warfare can be devastating and long-lasting, something modern societies with even more destructive weapons must keep in mind. The Mongols could destroy entire cities with medieval technology. Modern weapons could destroy entire civilizations. The speed of the Mongol conquests demonstrates that historical change can occur with shocking rapidity. Within a single human lifetime, the Mongols went from obscure tribal nomads to rulers of the largest land empire in history. Within another century, that empire had fragmented and declined. The lesson is that the world can change faster than people expect, that structures that seem permanent can collapse quickly, and that power can shift dramatically in short periods. This insight is relevant to understanding modern geopolitics, where the rise of new powers and the decline of old ones can occur within decades rather than centuries. The Mongol experience shows that neither the permanence of current arrangements nor the immutability of power hierarchies should be taken for granted. The Mongol Empire's religious tolerance stands as a historical example that contradicts narratives of inevitable religious conflict. The Mongols practiced shamanism but allowed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others to worship freely. They patronized all religions and saw value in all faith traditions. This tolerance was pragmatic rather than ideological. The Mongols understood that religious persecution would provoke resistance and that allowing freedom of worship cost them nothing while earning goodwill. The lesson is that religious diversity need not lead to conflict if political leaders are committed to tolerance. The Mongol example shows that societies with multiple faiths can coexist peacefully when tolerance is policy rather than exception. This lesson remains highly relevant in the modern world where religious conflicts continue to cause suffering. The technological transfers facilitated by the Mongol Empire demonstrate how conquest and empire building can have unintended consequences that outlast the empires themselves. The Mongols did not invent gunpowder, printing, or many other technologies, but they facilitated their spread across Eurasia. These technologies would fundamentally transform warfare, communication, and society in ways the Mongols never anticipated. Gunpowder weapons would eventually make cavalry warfare obsolete and contribute to the rise of centralized states with professional armies. Printing would enable mass literacy and the spread of ideas that would challenge traditional hierarchies. The lesson is that empires and conquerors often spread ideas and technologies that ultimately undermine the systems the conquerors established. Globalization creates connections and exchanges that have effects far beyond what any individual actor intends or controls. The Mongol experience with assimilation and cultural change illustrates the complex dynamics of cultural interaction. The Mongols conquered vast territories but were themselves changed by the peoples they ruled. In China, they became increasingly Chinese. In Persia, they became Persianized and converted to Islam. In Russia, the Golden Horde adopted Islam and Turkic culture. The conquerors were culturally absorbed by the conquered, though they also left their marks on the cultures that absorbed them. This dialectic of influence flowing both ways challenges simple narratives of conquest and domination. The lesson is that cultural exchange is rarely unidirectional, that conquerors influence the conquered but are also influenced by them, and that cultural identity is fluid rather than fixed. This insight is relevant to modern debates about immigration, multiculturalism, and cultural change. The military innovations of the Mongols, particularly their emphasis on mobility, intelligence, and combined arms operations, remain relevant to modern military thinking. The Mongol army was not just cavalry but a sophisticated force that integrated cavalry, infantry, siege weapons, and intelligence gathering into coordinated operations. They understood logistics, supply lines, and the importance of speed and surprise. They gathered intelligence systematically before campaigns and exploited enemy weaknesses ruthlessly. Modern military forces, despite having radically different technologies, still employ these same principles. The Mongol example shows that certain fundamental military principles transcend specific technologies. Superior information, better coordination, higher mobility, and more effective logistics will always provide advantages regardless of whether forces are using horses and bows or aircraft and missiles. The collapse of the Mongol Empire offers lessons about the limits of military power and the importance of institutional foundations. The Mongols built their empire through military conquest but did not create strong institutions to maintain it. They relied on the personal authority of strong khans and on military superiority. When leadership was weak or divided, and when military advantages eroded, the empire fragmented quickly. In contrast, empires and states that developed robust bureaucracies, legal systems, and ideological foundations proved more durable. Rome survived for centuries partly because it created institutions that could function independently of any single ruler. China repeatedly reunified after periods of division because of strong cultural and institutional continuity. The Mongol Empire lacked these deep foundations, making its collapse almost inevitable once the initial conquering generation passed. The question of how to evaluate the Mongol Empire morally remains difficult and contested. By modern standards, the Mongol conquests involved atrocities on a massive scale. Entire populations were massacred. Cities were destroyed. The death toll reached tens of millions. These actions cannot be justified or excused. At the same time, judging historical figures by contemporary moral standards has limitations. The Mongol era was violent throughout Eurasia, not just in Mongol conquests. Medieval warfare everywhere involved atrocities. The Mongols were not unique in their violence, though they were uniquely effective at it. Moreover, the Mongol Empire's later phases involved innovations in governance, tolerance, and cultural exchange that had positive effects. The challenge is to acknowledge both the terrible costs of Mongol conquests and the contributions of Mongol rule without excusing one or ignoring the other. The enduring fascination with Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire reflects something deep in human psychology. We are drawn to stories of individuals who rise from obscurity to world-changing importance, of underdogs who defeat more powerful opponents, of empires that reshape the world. Genghis Khan's story has all these elements. He was born into poverty and obscurity, suffered terrible hardships, overcame enormous obstacles, and created the largest land empire in history. His story is simultaneously inspiring and horrifying, a testament to what human will and determination can achieve and to the terrible costs of conquest and empire. The Mongols demonstrated that history is not predetermined, that small groups with determination and innovation can change the world, and that the consequences of those changes can echo for centuries. In the 21st century, when globalization connects distant regions and cultures interact constantly, when military technology enables destruction on scales the Mongols could never have imagined, and when questions about empire, multiculturalism, and the use of force remain contested, the Mongol experience offers a historical mirror. The Mongols showed what was possible with medieval technology and organization. They demonstrated both the power of cultural tolerance and the limits of rule by force. They facilitated connections across Eurasia while also causing immense destruction. They created an empire that changed the world but could not permanently alter the course of history. The Mongol Empire's rise, flourishing, and fall is a story about ambition, power, adaptability, and limits. It is a story about how individuals can shape history and how history ultimately transcends individual control. It is, finally, a story about humanity in all its complexity, cruelty, creativity, and capacity for both destruction and creation. The Mongols conquered half the world, and in doing so, they left lessons that remain relevant as long as humans seek to understand power, empire, and the forces that shape civilizations.